In this video, we are going to learn how to create and modify an SQL query using Java Persistence Query Language. And modifying a SQL query is the one that deletes a record from a database or updates a record in a database. So let's assume we need to update the record in a database and set email verification status to true or false. We already have an example of such SQL query, but that time we used native SQL query. So we, inside of add query annotation, we used value, and we have specifically mentioned it here that this query is native. And also in our SQL query, we used database table name and we used database table column names. Okay, so this time we are going to create a query using Java Persistence Query Language, and there will be some differences. Now let me paste a code snippet and I will walk you through this code snippet. So here's a query that will update user details in our database, and it will set email verification status to true or false depending on the value passed to a method as a parameter. Let me start from the new line here so that you can better see the two parameters that this method accepts. So we have a method that is called update user entity email verification status. And this method takes two parameters. It takes in email verification status and it takes in user ID so that we can identify this record and update email verification status just for the user ID that needs this update. We're using named parameters, and this is why each parameter in my method is annotated with @param annotation. Then inside of my SQL query, I use these parameters for email verification status, and I use user ID parameter for user ID field. And here we have a query itself. So this query is written using Java Persistence Query Language, and notice that it doesn't have the value attribute anymore, and it doesn't have attribute called native query true here. So JPQL queries do not have this. When we write JPQL queries, instead of using database table name and instead of using database column names, we use entity class name and entity class fields. This is why in my SQL query, I write update instead of table name users. I use user entity and I give it an alias, and then set email verification status inside of the user entity to the value that is sent as a parameter to my method. And if I open my user entity class, let me click on the user entity class to open, this field's email verification status and user ID need to match the field names that I use in my SQL query. Okay, and we have two annotations which are very important. First of all, we use @modifying annotation. We need to use it because this is a modifying query. We use @modifying annotation for those records that modify data in our database. And then we use @transactional annotation. This annotation will help to undo database changes if an error takes place in your code after you've called this method. I'm putting @transactional annotation here because I'm testing this method in user repository class directly, but usually you want to put this annotation in your REST controller class above the method that handles HTTP put or HTTP delete request, and you put this transactional annotation in your service class above the method that calls this update method in your user repository. If you do it this way, then if error takes place in your REST controller class or in your service class after you have called this method and this method made a change in a database, then all the changes will be rolled back and a database record will remain unmodified. Okay, so let's save this, and now let's go to user repository test and create a test method. I will find a method that updates user email verification status. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to reuse it because this method is going to be very, very similar for testing the JPQL query. So I will paste it here. Now I will rename this method. I will call it update user entity email verification status, and the rest is almost identical. So I'm creating an email verification status. This is a new email verification status, and I'm going to set it to let's say false first. And then I will need to use user repository and call update user entity email verification status. And let me delete this, the two parameters that I need, the email verification status and then the user ID. So after this query is performed, the database table record will be modified. With the next line of code, I will find user by user ID, and this method will return as a user entity, and then I will use this object stored user details to get email verification status, and then I will compare the new email verification status and the email verification status that is stored in the database, and they must match. If they do not match, then the method will fail. If they do match, then the test method is successful. So let me run this test method only and see if it passes. So I'll bring up the menu and I'll run this as JUnit test. Okay, and we got a green bar, which means that the test method is successful. Now I can change it to true and test again. So I'll run this method only. And we get a green bar again, which means that the test method is successful. Now I can run all test methods in my class and we still should get a green bar. Okay, so all of our 9 test methods have passed and we are good to continue.